Dear friends, I'm absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to sit together with you this evening. I hope that wherever you are, as you're listening to this talk, you're feeling at ease and joyful in body and mind. Many years ago, when I was Thich Nhat Hanh's attendant, he said something interesting to me. He said to me, Brother Phap, as practitioners, if we're truly aware, then there's nothing that's not the Dharma. There's nothing that's not a teaching. So from that point on, I took that teaching from Thich to heart. And whenever I go through my day, I have my antenna out for moments of Dharma, moments in which I'm able to open my heart just a little bit more. I remember in 1999, I was asked to lead a day of mindfulness in the English town of Norwich. And we had a beautiful day in a local community center. As part of the day, I led the group outside for a walking meditation to a local park. We were walking in silence and mindfully, just enjoying the opportunity to hear the sound of the wind and to be able to enjoy walking as a community. On the way to the park, two young teenage boys were riding their bikes, and they took a look at us, and the bikes screeched to a halt, and the teenage boys stood there looking at us. I guess they'd never seen anything quite like our group walking in mindfulness. And after a few seconds, it became too much for one of those young boys, and he called out, "So what's all this in aid of then?" Now, I thought that this was a very important and powerful question. I feel that it's a question that we as practitioners need to be asking ourselves constantly, that we need to be looking into constantly. Why are we a practitioner? What was that deep longing, that ache of the heart that brought us to practice? And more importantly, what exactly are we practicing? What exactly is our practice in each and every moment of our day? In this way, our practice, rather than being something amorphous, something vague, becomes something incredibly concrete, becomes something that's a lived reality in each and every moment. In Buddhist practice, particularly in the Mahayana school, we don't approach our practice from the perspective that we're broken and we need to be fixed. We're not trying to become something or someone other than who we really are. There's an interesting story told in the commentaries that after the Buddha had his awakening experience, that the first thing that he said was, "How strange. Every living being has this capacity, this place in their heart that's unobstructed." And so from the Mahayana perspective, our practice is a practice of uncovering that place of goodness, that place of insight, that unobstructed mind that's already there, that's been there all along, but has somehow gotten covered over. To uncover these pockets of goodness that are in us and in all beings already. One of the greatest teachers in my own spiritual lineage, Master Rinzai, once said that the aim of spiritual practice or the aim of meditation practice is to become a real human being. To be able to walk on the earth of our own lived experience. To not walk on clouds or on water. In fact, he said to walk on clouds or to walk on water, that's not a miracle. The real miracle is to be able to walk on the earth. To be fully present for what is, and to give up all of our running, all of our seeking after something that we think will cover over or fix this ache in our heart. So to become a real human being seems to some of us to be almost antithetical to the practice of spirituality, particularly if we equate spirituality with transcendence. But from the Buddhist perspective, spiritual practice is not about transcendence, not about rising above our everyday experience, but about transformation, about entering deeply into our everyday experience and discovering wisdom right in the heart of it. This is what is meant on a deep level by engaged Buddhism. engaging with each and every moment of our daily life just as it is, as our spiritual practice, as a moment to wake up. Whether we're in traffic, whether we're in lockdown, whether we're in the checkout line, each and every moment that might be described as being absolutely ordinary can be extraordinary. This is the power of an innate energy that we all have, that in English we call mindfulness. To be honest, I don't like the word mindfulness as a translation for this quality of presence of mind and heart that in the original Pali language is called sati. This is because in our modern society we've grown up with the idea that mind is somehow up here. In fact, if I ask you to point to your mind, unless you're being quite zen about the whole situation, most of us would point up here. Now let's try an experiment, because I really feel that our bodies are some of the greatest teachers that we'll ever meet. Let's imagine that we're in a classroom and I'm writing an equation on the board and you haven't studied at all, and suddenly I call out your name to come up and solve the equation on the board, and you say, "Who, me?" and then point to yourself. Let's do that for a moment. Let's point to ourselves. Okay. Now just take a moment to notice where you're pointing. Very few of you, when you're pointing to yourself, will be pointing here. Most of you will instinctively point to your heart area, to the center of your being. This is not just a fun game, but this is an important reminder. In the Vedic philosophy of the Buddha's time, the seat of consciousness was not seen to be the brain as we would tend to see it today. It was actually seen to be the heart. There are many reasons for this, which are beyond the scope of our talk this evening. But we know that in modern days, we've discovered that the heart consists of 60% neural cells. Now, of course, there's a lot of debate about what that actually means, but on a fundamental level, we know that the heart, just like all parts of our body, have a form of consciousness. Basically, in the Vedic philosophy of the Buddha's time, they felt that if your heart stopped beating, then consciousness would leave the body. So that's why the heart was seen to be the fundamental base of consciousness. This tendency of equating mind and heart and not having a separation as we tend to have in the West continues on through a number of the Asian languages. If you speak Chinese, you'll know that the character for mind and heart is the same. The same in Vietnamese, the word for mind and heart is the same. You need to have an additional character or an additional word to distinguish whether you're speaking about mind as consciousness or heart as a physical location or an emotion. This is helpful medicine for us in the West, because often we equate mindfulness with an intellectual energy, or we equate samadhi, concentration, as an intellectual concentration, when in fact it's equally valid in a sense, and perhaps good medicine for us in the West, to understand sati more as a sense of heartfulness, in the sense of a full-bodied awareness, an embodied awareness, coming back to an awareness of our body, an awareness of our emotions, awareness of our feelings, rather than only an analytical concentration up here. Mindfulness gives rise to an energy, a quality that we call samadhi, which is translated as concentration. In fact, if you consider how we view concentration in the West or in modern society, it doesn't feel very refreshing. Let's imagine you're studying for the bar exam, or you're studying for the HSC or something. You don't feel very refreshed after that kind of concentration. Meditative concentration, just like the energy of mindfulness, is quite different. It's not only a mental energy up here, but a full-bodied awareness. Concentration in Buddhism is described as being deeply refreshing, like plunging into a cool lake on a warm day. It can be very good medicine for our times to consider mindfulness in terms of this full-bodied awareness that we can quite validly translate sati as heartfulness. A few years ago, this was quite a few years ago now, maybe 20 years ago, we were sitting in the meditation hall in Upper Hamlet of Plum Village, waiting for our teacher to give a Dharma talk, and he began his Dharma talk, and then it began raining. Now I should say that rain in the south of France, particularly around Bordeaux, which is not that unusual, but for some reason that day, Tay stopped giving his Dharma talk. And he said to the community, everybody should go and open windows, open doors, and go and sit and listen to the rain. So we all just went and we sat near windows or out on the veranda and just listened to the rain. The loud drops, the soft drops, all the different sounds that were occurring. Now I realized at that moment in time that Tay wasn't just asking us to listen to the rain for the sake of listening to the rain, although that is already a very deep practice. What he was asking us to do was to open a space of availability, to listen to our lives. When you choose to listen fully, you're opening a space of availability to what is. You're not evaluating, you're not judging, you're not reacting, you're just simply there. And this capacity to listen is truly the heart of meditation. This sense of opening a space of availability for what is already happening in body and mind. Let us approach our meditation practice from the perspective of listening. Listening not only with our ears, but listening with our eyes, listening with our nose, listening with our tongue, listening with our whole body, of engaging with what is right in each and every moment. A few years ago, I was asked to lead a course at the University of Montana in Missoula. And I was walking around the campus and a young guy came up to me. Oftentimes when we're wearing a monastic robe, it's an invitation for people to come up and say all kinds of things that are on their mind. So he saw me and he came right up to me and said, "What's the meaning of life then?" Another very good question. And in fact, it's a question that most of us have. But like many good questions, sometimes the way we ask it can prevent us from touching deep wisdom that's just a little bit outside of our grasp. That's the way that that young fellow asked the question is the way that many of us ask that question, the way that many of us approach this question of deeper meaning in our life. But the Buddhist way to ask that question, the Buddhist way to engage with that question is quite different. The way that as meditation practitioners we would want to engage with that question, rather than just asking the question of what's the meaning of life and presupposing that there's some meaning outside of ourselves somewhere that's preordained. As Buddhists, we would want to approach the question from the perspective of how do I bring meaning to my life? How do I live this moment or each moment of my life in such a way that it's the most meaningful and most beautiful moment that I've encountered up until now? We can't always, or even very often in our lives, choose our circumstances. But the freedom we have as human beings is to be able to choose to live this moment in such a way that it becomes a deep moment, a moment in which we come fully to life, a moment in which we're able to touch things just a little bit more deeply. In that way, each moment becomes a meaningful moment, becomes a moment that's incredibly rich, incredibly deep. There was once a man who came to visit the Buddha, and he spent a day practicing together with the Buddha's community. And then at the end of the day, the Buddha said, well, how did you enjoy your practice together with us? And the man said, I'm quite surprised. I spent the day together with the community, and actually you don't do anything different from what I do at home. And the Buddha said, that's right. We walk, we sit, we eat, but there is a difference. We walk in such a way that we know that we're walking. We eat in such a way that we know that we're eating. We lie down in such a way that we know that we lie down. In that way, we do things quite differently to the way you do it at home. And this is really the essence also of engaged Buddhism, of using the absolutely ordinary moments of our life as our spiritual practice. Very few of us have the opportunity in our life to sit meditation for 8 hours a day. Such a thing is incredibly rare. But what we can do is to walk in such a way that we're walking fully, to eat in such a way that we're eating deeply, to breathe in such a way that we're deeply in contact with our breath. What a precious gift. What a precious way to go just a little bit more deeply, to be able to understand each moment and to touch a little bit more of reality in each moment. It's quite a powerful and important practice for us to be able to return to what we call bare experience, to recognize the stories that we tell, and to understand that the stories we tell ourselves are often not reality at all. And the fact is, most of the time, rather than being in contact with reality, with things as they are, we're interpreting reality in some way, subtle or overt. One of the great teachings in the Buddhist canon is in the Udana, in the first chapter of the Udana, and it's a teaching given to Bahia of the bark cloth. Now, like a lot of great characters in the Buddhist canon, he has a great backstory. It's said that Bahia was a trader from the area that we would now call Myanmar, Burma, and he was on a small ship traveling to deliver goods, and he was caught in a shipwreck, and he washed up on the coast of India with all of his clothes washed off. And like any of us do in that moment when he was laying on the beach, he said, well, that must be a sign for me to become a wanderer. So he became a wanderer and didn't have any clothes, so he covered himself with bark and with leaves and became known as Bahia of the bark cloth. So at one time he heard about the Buddha, and he thought, what a great opportunity for me to receive teachings from the Buddha. So he came to the Buddha and he asked the Buddha to teach him the Dharma. And the Buddha offered him a very short teaching, but a teaching which I feel is one of the most important teachings in the Pali Canon. The Buddha said to Bahia, in reference to the scene, when you see something, just see it. When you hear something, just hear it. And so on. He goes through all of the senses. When you taste something, just taste it. And when there's no you in connection with each of those things, when there's no therefore with each of those experiences, then you have a chance to transform your suffering. Most of the time, for us as human beings, we live in the therefore. We have an experience, a taste, a smell, a touch, a thought, and so on. And we interpret that in some way, subtle or less subtle. And we call that interpretation reality. For example, we might be sitting here and we might be feeling cold. Now, if there's another person in the room, that person might not be feeling cold at all. Very simple example. We just, each and every moment, our interpretations are what we call reality. They're based on our past experiences, our cultural tendencies, our ancestral tendencies, the own environmental factors, genetic sensitivities, and so on. Now, it's not a problem to tell ourselves stories. It's not a problem to interpret. This is what we do as human beings. This is part of being human, to interpret our experience in some way. But as practitioners, we want to get interested and become aware of the fact that we're mostly interpreting rather than in contact with bare experience, things just as they are. And to understand the difference between the stories we tell ourselves and reality. Life is so humbling. A few years ago, I had the chance to spend a spring in Plum Village after 7 years of absence. I'd spent 7 years in our monastery in the United States. So I was really excited to spend the spring in Plum Village. So I spent a lot of time enjoying walking meditation around Upper Hamlet, and I remember spending a lot of time near one of the lotus ponds. And on one of the lotus ponds there were 2 ducks that were always floating together around the pond. So I spent a lot of time looking at these ducks and thinking thoughts such as, isn't nature wonderful? These ducks are always together. It's just such a beautiful thing. And I would literally spend half an hour just sitting there. Towards the end of my stay, I was having tea with one of the brothers, and he said, Brother Phap, what did you enjoy most about your stay in Plum Village? I said, I enjoyed so many things, but one of the things I enjoyed the most was looking at those ducks floating on the pond. It was just such a lovely experience whenever I would see them floating around. And he began laughing, and he said, Brother Phap, it's been so funny to watch you look at those ducks and to tell the brothers how much you enjoyed them. The ducks are made of styrofoam. Each of us has styrofoam ducks in our life. Each of us has things that we're looking at and calling reality, when in fact it's not quite reality. And so in the Plum Village tradition, we have a short question that we ask ourselves in each and every moment. If we think something is real, we think something is true, whether it's an idea about ourselves or an idea about somebody else, or an idea about an emotion that we're experiencing, an idea about our suffering. And that is to ask ourselves, am I sure? Am I sure that I understand this situation, the other person, myself, my emotion fully? And then if I'm sure, check again. Very rarely in our life can we answer that we're fully sure, that we fully understand something clearly. There's always something more to discover. And life, and particularly the life of a practitioner, is always a process of discovery. Discovering more and more each and every moment about the breath, about our step, about the way that our own mind works. This is indeed something precious. Buddhism is literally translated as the way of waking up. This is what the word Buddhism means. And for me, I want to invite you to consider deeply, if you are a Buddhist practitioner, or you come to the Buddhist library, which is the library of waking up, then I'd like to ask you, as a gift to yourself, to take time to consider to yourself, what do you need to wake up to? If you are a Buddhist practitioner on the path of awakening, then what is it that you need to wake up to? What is it that you want to become? It's another way of asking the question earlier that I asked. What is it that you want to become? So maybe we can take a moment to reflect on that question. It's similar in terms of that question. I asked the question of why did you, what was that longing in your heart that brought you to practice? In some way, asking the question of what is it you want to become is a similar way of approaching the same issue. What is it that you want to become? So let's just ask ourselves that question, just for a few moments, and reflect on what answer arises, what word arises. It might be happy. I want to be happy. Or it might be peaceful. Or perhaps it might be I want to be enlightened. You never know what word might arise. So if something arises, what do I want to become? Then celebrate that. Take a moment to just enjoy the fact that a word or a phrase arose. For most people, we don't even ask ourselves that question, that important question. So that's already a great thing. But most of the time, that's where we stop. We stop with simply asking that question, what do I want to become, or what am I looking for? And a word such as peace, or happiness or enlightenment arises, and we congratulate ourselves and we move on. But we don't take the time to stop and reflect on what is our actual embodied experience of happiness. What is our actual embodied experience of peace? What is our embodied experience in this very moment, not 10 or 20 years in the future, of awakening? I would say, let's say that right now there are 20 of us who, when we asked ourselves that question, the word happiness arose. Now, we have this assumption that everybody else's idea of happiness is the same as ours, but it's not the case. If we went around the room and asked those 20 people to describe their embodied experience of happiness, then we may have 20 quite different and unique takes on what the experience of happiness actually is. I think it's important for us to go just a little bit more deeply each moment. It's so easy to get stuck in the realm of concepts rather than sinking down into that level of our embodied experience. So when the word happiness arose or the word peace arose, what do you mean by that? What's your experience of that? I love to tell the story of about 5 years ago, my younger brother came to visit me in Deer Park. It had been a very long time since we'd seen each other. We were separated as children. And when he came to the monastery, we had a lovely week together. And during his visit, I said to him, what would you like to do together? And he said, you know what, actually what I'd like to do is, it's a kind of a strange request, but what I'd like to do is to take you to Universal Studios. And I thought, oh my God, no, like I'm a monk, I live in a monastery, like I've got no interest to go to Universal Studios. So I thought to myself, how do I get out of this? And I hit on what I thought was the perfect way to escape from that trip to Universal Studios. I said, that's a brilliant idea, Ben. The way we do things in the monastery is the whole community needs to decide. So please, in the next community meeting, you need to present your request to the brothers, and the brothers will consider it, and then they'll give permission for me to go or not. So I thought to myself, safe. There's no way the brothers will allow me to go to Universal Studios, so I don't need to worry. Then the meeting came along a few days later, and my brother presented his request, and the brothers met and discussed it, and they all said, Brother Phap, hi, we think it would be great for you to go to Universal Studios. Go, enjoy the day with your brother. So I went off to Universal Studios with my brother, and it had been a quarter of a century at that point since I'd been to an amusement park. It's really also not a place that Buddhist monastics go. And then, so we went on to the first roller coaster ride, and I was sitting there with my brother. And we got to the end of the ride, and as we got off the ride, my brother ran. He got off the roller coaster, and he ran to a little kiosk nearby and was scrolling through an iPad, and he burst out laughing, and I was wondering what was going on. So I went over to him, and I looked over his shoulder, and I saw that, in fact, there was a photo of our carriage of the roller coaster, and in that carriage you can see everybody in the photo has their hands up going, ah, they were so excited. And there's a picture of me in there with my eyes closed and holding onto the rail. One person's idea of happiness is not necessarily another person's idea of happiness. And the same goes for peace. The same goes for liberation. The same goes for any word that arises. So I'd like to ask you in your practice life to ask yourself that question, what is it that I want to become? and sink down into what you mean by that word. Because if you sink down into what you mean by that word, then it's possible to be able to take the next step, which is to ask yourself how you might practice to be able to touch that quality in each and every moment. So that happiness, that peace, that liberation, whatever word arose, it's not something that occurs only 10, 15, 20 years down the track after a lot of hard labor, but is something that's a lived and embodied reality right in each and every moment. And this is something that is possible. This is something that's possible to do. It's possible to live this moment, each moment of your life, just as it is, as a moment of opening your heart, as a moment of waking up, as a moment of seeing the stories that you tell yourself, and going just a little bit more deeply. Dear friends, I am so delighted to have had the opportunity to have shared a few words with you, and I'm looking forward to enjoying your questions and having an exchange with you in just a few moments. Blessings.